You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Nancy Richardson Fischer.
Thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. It's September. That means it's a new month full of brand new author interviews. We have got a loaded schedule for this month. I'm really excited for you to hear some of the shows that we have lined up for you with some tremendous authors telling stories about storytelling and the creative process. Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are links in the right-hand sidebar where you can subscribe to the show on any platform that you listen to podcasts on. hankgarner.com, where you can listen on the site or subscribe everywhere. Today's show is brought to you by Grammarly, an intelligent writing app. Download Grammarly's browser extension and create a free Grammarly account at www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. That's www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. Grammarly is an excellent tool that will help you get your document that you're working on in shape before sending it off to your editor for that final pass. If you need that first look, Grammarly is the place to go. Also, for all of your correspondence on the web, Grammarly can help you make sure that you're saying what you intend to say. Get Grammarly.com/Hank. Also, thanks to my buddy C. Stephen Manley for sponsoring the show. His book, Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files, Book 1, is one of my favorite urban fantasy books that have come out this year. Chuck has been on the show before. He's one of the hosts of Keystroke Medium, one of my favorite group of guys, and one of my favorite podcasts out there. Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files, Book 1. Clint Mercer is about to get a crash course in magic. I love this book. I know you will too. Pick up Master of Hounds today. There's a link to it in the show notes. We'll talk more about it as the month goes on. Now on to our author interview for today. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Nancy Richardson Fischer on the show with me today. Nancy has a brand new book that when you're hearing this, it's out everywhere now. Looks like it's hardcover, Kindle, audiobook, any way that you consume books, you can get a copy of When Elephants Fly. Welcome to the show, Nancy.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to have you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
First memory. It's actually, I decided I wanted to be a comedian. So as a little kid, probably 7 or 8, I looked up jokes in a joke book and I wrote them on index cards, and I carried the cards around with me wherever I went and tried to tell jokes, and I was terrible. And that's my first experience writing.
Oh, that's amazing. So just wanting to entertain people, and was that something? Were you a precocious kid? Were you always vying for attention?
I think yes. I definitely, I was an athlete more than anything as a kid. I was a diver, and I think I chose that because you got to stand alone on the diving board, whereas the swimmers they were all in the pool at the same time. So I think I did like the attention, but as I got older, I prefer the attention of writing and not necessarily standing up in front of a live crowd.
Right. Were you a big reader when you were young?
I was. We went to the library every Saturday. We checked out probably 10 books each and consumed them all week, and then went back to the library the next Saturday for 10 more. And it was my favorite place.
I love it. What kinds of books did you did you love, and what sorts of stories resonated with you?
I loved stories where you could travel to another world. So I loved C.S. Lewis, A Wrinkle in Time, anything that had a little bit of a fantasy element. As a kid, I just remember everywhere we'd go, if there was a wardrobe, I'd open it and knock on it and hope for a secret door that would lead me into Narnia. So I had a big imagination, and I liked any books that kind of tapped into that.
You know, of all of the authors that I've talked to, I think Narnia is probably the most referenced series as a series that really opened kids' imaginations. And I think it's almost, you know, especially people born in the last half century, last half of the 20th century and above. It's like this singular cultural touchstone for a lot of readers but writers especially. It's fascinating that you hear people that write thrillers and people that write mysteries and people that write science fiction and fantasy and humor, and they all have this similar experience with Narnia. It's pretty crazy.
It is pretty crazy, because you ask anyone, if I ask any of my friends, they'll say the same thing, that is the one book that, you know, they really think of when they think of their childhood. It opened a door to imagination in everybody's minds.
So fun. At what point did you start writing stories? So we know that you were writing jokes and trying to entertain people, but at what point did you realize that you could go a little deeper and create worlds of your own?
Probably in college. I think I always, you know, wrote for classes and knew that I was a good writer in school, that I could write a paper really easily and quickly. Embarrassed to say I wrote a lot of friends' papers too. But I knew that I could write in that way. But in college, when I started taking creative writing classes, that's when I thought, wow, this is something I really, really love to do. But I never thought that I could do it for a living. Because that's not something people steer you toward when you're in college. They don't say, oh, be a writer. They say, you know, go into advertising or event planning, but never, you know, just be a creative writer.
Right. Find some honorable way to make a living. And
exactly.
Right. You had an interesting job after college as a writer for Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey. What was that about?
So my first job after college was working as a traveling writer for Ringling Brothers. And the way I got the job, they flew me to Ohio, I think it was, to interview King Tusk, the largest traveling land mammal on the face of the earth. He was a big elephant. And I did kind of a fake interview with him. I got that job. And then for the next year, I traveled with one of the units of the circus. And whenever there was a story about a performer that lived in a certain city where the circus was traveling, I would write a story and give it to a local newspaper so that they could put it in their Sunday supplemental section. So they didn't need to send a journalist out. I would just cover the story. And it was a crazy first job. It was super exciting. The performers were amazing, passing their skills down generations. I'd like to say that I realized right away what was going on with the animals, but I really didn't. I avoided them. The tigers spray on you, and you can't get the smell out of your clothes, and the elephants sneeze. And then one day I was walking in the back of an arena with a guest, and that guest, we walked by the line of elephants who were shackled by one leg, and they sway. And the guest asked me why they were swaying, and I said what all the people around me were saying, which is they like the music. And in that moment, I realized that they don't like the music. They're kind of going crazy, losing their minds. Their spirits are broken. And I quit that job not long thereafter and kind of promised myself that if I had the opportunity to shine a light on the lives of animals, wild animals in captivity, and also in their natural habitats, I would. And that's one of the elements that led to my writing When Elephants Fly.
Wow. What did you do when you left that job?
When I left that job, I moved to Colorado and I skied for a year and waitressed.
Like you do?
Yes. And then following that, I went to California and I worked as the senior campaign writer for the University of California, San Francisco. And did that job for about a year and a half. And then ended up doing some freelance work for Lucasfilm, writing a trilogy of Star Wars books. And I think around age 24, I got my first sport autobiography where I co-wrote with Bella Karolyi, who's a Romanian gymnastics coach. Wow. And I co-wrote his story.
So there's, I'm picking up on some very eclectic, not only influences, like we talked about earlier, but, interest and, very eclectic, artistic expression. Everything from making up stories about animals to writing Star Wars and then autobiographies. Do you see a thread of commonality in the projects that you have taken on and the interest that you pursued?
I think the one thread is that everything I take on scares me at first because I have no idea what I'm doing at first. And I like the feeling of having to be creative in that environment. So I didn't know anything about the circus or the behind the scenes or being around people who, worked for the show. And it was kind of a crazy, fast, scary environment. And I liked seeing how I could perform in that environment. I didn't know anything about grant writing when I worked for UCSF. I loved Star Wars, but had no idea about the breadth of the Star Wars universe or if I could write middle grade stories. And then when I got my first autobiography with Bella Karolyi, he actually flew me to his ranch to meet him. And we spent the whole weekend dirt biking and hiking and doing all these fun things and not talking about the book. And when he took me back to the airport, I said, Bella, hey, what do you think? And he said, you're hired. And I said, I like you. I think that's a huge mistake. I've never written a book before. And he said he thought I could do it. And I thought, I don't think I can do it, but this is exciting. Maybe I can. So I think it's challenging myself is the one thread throughout.
Wow. You've gone on to write a number of sports autobiographies that you co-wrote. From not having done that to looks like you've done about 6 or so. Is there something about sports autobiographies that resonate with you? Is there something about those kinds of personal stories that intrigue you?
Definitely, I like stories about people who are passionate about a singular thing. I find that really interesting. Each of the people I wrote about were completely devoted to their sport, whether they were a jockey or a speed skater or a gymnast. So I enjoy that. I'm also an athlete, not at their level, but I'm really passionate about sports as well. So I think it was a natural fit for me to understand why they love doing what they do.
What was the most difficult aspect of getting into someone else's head or interpreting their voice? Because when you're ghostwriting or co-writing, the goal is to not sound like Nancy, but to sound like the other person. Is that a difficult process to find that voice and to get immersed in it?
I was really lucky because all the people pretty much that I worked with allowed me to be part of their life. I spent a ton of time with them. And so when you spend a lot of time, for example, Monica Seles, I traveled with her. I went to her practices. Julie Crone, I shared a condominium with her. We had lots of late night chats. For me, that part wasn't that difficult. I think that the hard part is just giving up your life and just completely becoming part of their life, their schedule, their workout schedule, their travel schedule. That's more challenging to me. But actually finding their voice, because people were really pretty open with me, wasn't that difficult.
Yeah. From doing those to your Star Wars Junior Jedi Knights series, those are those are probably middle grade, aren't they? More than YA.
Yes, for sure.
transitioning from there to your new book, When Elephants Fly, is a different vein, definitely, more mature subject matter, more mature characters. First off, before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, what inspired When Elephants Fly?
So When Elephants Fly was inspired by two things. First, my time at the circus and my desire to somehow, I believe in karmiquences. I believe that my time at the circus, I need to make up for. And my hope is that shining a light on the lives of elephants who perform or do not have fantastic lives in some zoos in some way makes up for my time working for the circus. But the real inspiration is I have a dear friend, and I'm just going to say her name is B, which isn't her name, who grew up with a mom with a mental health condition. And hearing her stories about the erratic behavior of her mom, the cruel things that people said, the times when she was young, when her mom was placed in different hospitals to adjust her medications, that was super heartbreaking to hear. Also heartbreaking was that B grew up afraid that she would experience some of her mom's issues. There's approximately a 10% chance if a parent has a mental health condition that their child will also have some sort of mental health issue. And that number seems really small if you're not one of those people with a family member with a mental health condition. But if you're a kid growing up knowing there's a 10% chance that you too could have the same issues, it's pretty overwhelming. And my friend chose to avoid some of the triggers that might lead to mental health issues, but to really embrace life and live it fully. She went to college, she got her dream job, she got married, she had a child. But her situation made me wonder about all the people who couldn't overcome their fears, the people who are frozen in the moment or afraid to take chances, or who overheard conversations like my main character Lily did. She overheard someone saying crazy is genetic. And that shaped her entire life and how she saw herself, and it made her really frozen in the moment. And so I started thinking about those people, and that really inspired my protagonist. I wanted to create a young woman who's stuck in her life because she's afraid of what's going to happen to her between the ages of 18 and 30, which is when she's most at risk for developing schizophrenia. And then I wanted to create a situation where she chose to put aside her fears of the future and to live in the moment, to fight for something that was more important to her than herself. So that's the main inspiration for When Elephants Fly.
Well, those adolescent years, those teenage years, a lot of kids, and I'm speaking about me here, who are very neurotic, and, everything in the world bothers you, and you're self-conscious, and you're, what everybody else thinks matters so much. And, we tend to be very introspective, and just everything is magnified. Now, you take that typical teenage neurosis and put a history of family mental illness, and that's a recipe for disaster for a lot of kids.
Definitely. It definitely is.
Yeah. So you have a friend who went through some of this, but she was the one that was able to just power through it and choose to not get caught up in that. But for Lily, your character, she is really struggling through this, and she recruits her best friend. How did the character start to take shape for you? Lily obviously is based on your wondering about what would happen to a person like this. But what about the other characters in the book?
No, I think Sawyer, who's Lily's best friend, is the best friend everybody's always wanted to have.
He's like the best friend in a John Hughes movie. Exactly.
He really is. But I think sometimes we look at people who seem to have everything and we forget that they too have an internal struggle. And so I really created him to show that as much as you depend upon the people around you when you're going through a struggle, you have to remember that the people around you also have a struggle going on in their lives. So he really came from my desire to just show that there's intricacies in friendships, and that you have to remember that no matter how much you need your friend to support you, you have to remember that they too need your support. And then Otis is just like the dreamy guy, the dark horse dreamy guy that you have a crush on, and he too has his own backstory and things that he's struggling with. And I guess Otis is my desire to show that things are never what they seem to be. And, here's a guy who's working for his family's circus and supporting them in all that they do, but he has a backstory and an internal struggle and things that drive him toward the decisions that he makes. And I wanted somebody else to be struggling with living in the moment and facing potential loss of freedom and family at the same time that Lily was. So it wasn't just all on her, that there were other stakes in the game.
Right. Well, in mentioning Otis, and the title alludes to it as well. There's an elephant connection in this book, and the story that you told us earlier about your experience with the circus. How did that thread of story that you wanted to tell work its way into this story?
I knew that Lily needed something or someone to love and fight for that would allow her to put aside her own fears. I also knew that I wanted to write a story that had elephants in it. So a little selfish on my part, but there was, I can't remember the year it was, but maybe 10 years ago, an elephant calf was born at the Portland Zoo in Portland, Oregon. And somehow it came out in the news that the sire of that elephant calf belonged to Have Trunks Will Travel, which is a performing elephant show. And the public heard about this and heard that legally Have Trunks Will Travel owned the calf that had just been born. And there was enormous public outrage. People were terrified that baby elephant that they immediately fell in love with was going to be taken and put into a traveling circus. And the amount of attention and upset that caused informed me that a baby elephant was something that could do the same for a story Lily might write and for Lily herself, especially if that elephant calf's early experiences with her mother reflected Lily's own experiences with her own mother, who tries to fly off a rooftop with her when she's 7 years old.
Yeah, I was going to say that the storyline of the elephant mother and Lily's mother is especially poignant, in that she gets to in some strange way work out her own. Not necessarily solve, but work out and work on these feelings that she has for her mother. When you're writing that, did that scenario immediately come to you, or in the writing of it, did you have an aha moment that, this would really be a great point to tie these threads together for Lily?
It was definitely intentional. I wanted Swifty's story to mirror Lily's so that Lily could bond immediately with this elephant calf and be drawn into her life. Because when she's trying to save Swifty, she's also trying to save herself.
Right.
When you tell a story like this, it's very easy to be overbearing and to be very on the nose, if you will, or on the trunk. But
right.
With kind of what your feelings are about these situations, and it to really turn into maybe a cautionary tale or an ABC after school special. But the way you draw these characters and give them a reality, is very striking on the page, and it comes away as a very exciting book, funny book, very engaging without me feeling like Nancy is feeding me what she wants me to think about these situations. Is that difficult in writing a book like this?
Well, thank you first for the compliment. So I look at what's going on in the world these days. We're a really fractured society where one side's yelling at the other side and nobody's hearing what anybody's saying anymore. And I wanted to write a story that didn't do that. That's a universal story about living in the moment, a universal story about overcoming fears, but nothing that tells anyone how they have to feel. Because when you tell people how they have to feel and you yell it at them over and over again, they stop listening. And that's something I realized, when I first worked for the circus, it was really interesting. PETA was always protesting at every arena we went to. And I would have to walk through protesters with signs, and they would always be yelling at me or dumping truckfuls of manure on the driveway so we couldn't get through. And while I completely appreciate what PETA does and agree with a lot of it, the level of vitriol and that they used made me not hear their message. And I think that's the exact same thing that's going on in politics today. I think nobody can hear what anybody's saying anymore. So my hope in writing this was that I threaded in information that I thought was important, but tried to stop short of telling anybody how to interpret it. And hopefully that makes it a more powerful novel because people can draw their own conclusions.
Well, yeah, and it's expertly done in your book. Talking about PETA and politics, what people lose is that the value of an economy of words, and it's kind of like the person that you meet who uses the F word every sentence, and then when there's a real situation that really needs to be that needs to have an exclamation point put on it, when that word would really be powerful, it's no longer powerful because you're just desensitized to it. It's just overused. Yeah, and a book with a message, air quotes, has a tendency to do that. But when you couch it in fiction and tie these elements together with a character that is so utterly believable and that we can all connect to, it just becomes more powerful.
Well, thank you. I hope so. Every author has hopes of what their story might bring to someone or might do. I hope that, if nothing else, that readers will develop more of an empathy toward people who are dealing with mental health conditions, that they'll realize that they were once a kid just like Lily with hopes and dreams, and that people who actually read this who are dealing with mental health conditions will find some hope when reading the story. And of course, I also hope that people will look at the resource section and say, how can I get involved in saving elephants from extinction? Because they're going to be gone in the next 20 years in the wild if no one does anything.
When you're dealing with heady topics like this, a lot of times that goes over easier and becomes more engaging for the reader if you can make them laugh every now and then. And we talk about people that, especially that write suspense novels and thrillers, and the need to let the reader off the hook every now and then. If you keep their adrenaline pumping and their heart pounding 200 beats a minute constantly, then there's no recovery, then those epically intense scenes are not as powerful. The same thing when you're dealing with mental illness or a subject, like we're dealing with elephants in captivity. the heart can only take so much grief in one dose. But if you can make readers laugh a little bit, then those deep moments and those really high moments are really contrasted, and it makes for a more human experience when reading. How did you handle the humorous aspects of the book and making sure that we got all of Lily's personality and not just the fears and the neuroses?
I tried to give Lily some gallows humor, where she could laugh a little bit at her own situation and at her own 12-year plan to not trigger schizophrenia. I tried to do the same with Sawyer. He has to laugh a bit about the ridiculousness of getting kicked out of his home, but having so much money that he can live anywhere. And the two of them riffing off each other, I think, give the reader a little bit of a break from the main issues of the story. I also tried to make, Swifty and Swifty's best friend, the dog Flea, kind of like a beautiful moments that interrupted the sadness of, being in a little cage at the circus. So I tried to kind of sprinkle those throughout because, there's that thing that people say about, I jumped out of an airplane, but my parachute didn't open, and then it finally opened, but when I landed in a pile of hay, but there was a pitchfork in the pile of hay. You go from one catastrophe to the next, and I didn't want this story to feel like that.
Gotcha. Well, what a beautiful and powerful book that it is. Nancy, I love this book, When Elephants Fly. It's on sale everywhere now. For our listeners, there's links to it in the show notes. And like you mentioned earlier, I do want to highlight this. There are some great resources in the back of the book where you can find out how you can get involved in a number of efforts. Nancy, if people are just learning about you, where could they find you online to get plugged in and find out more about you? Maybe look through your back catalog and kind of follow along your journey.
Thank you. They can find me at NancyRichardsonFischer.com.
Excellent. We'll put a link to it. Nancy, we wish you much success on the book launch, and thank you for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much, Hank. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. "Hello?" He shook off gooseflesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. "You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed." He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. "Please come." Joey shook his head. "No way. Ain't gonna happen." But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him, after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. "Where are you?" he whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees. The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. "What do you want?" Joey whispered. "Play." He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. "Come and play, Joey." He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. "Play with us." He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.